Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. License test. There are no other two words that can strike both the same amount of excitement and fear in a Gran Turismo player. On one hand, they're a cornerstone of the franchise, a rite of passage that Gran Turismo just wouldn't feel the same without. But on the other, they can also be extremely tedious, frustrating, and at times, completely pointless. License tests are just one of those things in Gran Turismo that we kind of accept without thinking about too deeply. Grinding away at them every time we start a new game is almost like a ritual, and not something that we often question. After all, they've been part of the series since day one, and have carried through to every mainline title in some form. But, over the course of this franchise, how have they changed? Also, what exactly makes the license tests in one game better than those in another? Is there even an objective way to judge the quality of license tests? Hell, do they even contribute anything to the overall experience, or are they just a massive waste of time? When you really dig into it, the topic of license tests is a lot more complex than you might realize. So, let's try and find some answers to those questions as we dive into the history of license tests in Gran Turismo. Cast your mind back to the mid-90s. You are Kazunori Yamauchi, a developer within Sony who's working on his dream project, that being a game centered on simulation racing with real cars. Naturally, to create such a game, the likes of which hadn't really been done before, you would need to have a pretty solid grasp on driving in real life to be able to accurately translate the experience. So, you set about gaining more confidence behind the wheel, even attending a driving school hosted by professional racer Takashi Oi. Here, you learn the fundamentals of high-performance driving on a closed circuit. But not only does this experience help you to define how the cars should handle in your game, it also gives you the idea for an entirely new game mode. The original Gran Turismo was a trendsetter in many ways when it released in late 1997, but one of its many groundbreaking features was known as License Mode. Within it, you could find 3 sub-areas marked as licenses, each of which containing 8 individual license tests. The tests themselves are effectively time trials where you have to complete a section of track using a specific car within a time limit. If you can complete this without running off the track or hitting any walls, you're then ranked based on your time with either a bronze, silver, or gold award. The primary purpose of these license tests is to get players accustomed to the dynamics of driving in Gran Turismo. While simulation-oriented racing games are commonplace nowadays, back then it was kind of a foreign concept to the mainstream gaming audience. Concerned that players would struggle with the game's more in-depth handling model, these tests were devised as a way for them to learn the ropes. License Mode is pretty much a recreation of Kaz's own experience at the real-life driving school, complete with brief text explaining what you need to do to succeed. This is also why the tests start off so basic, requiring you to just accelerate and then stop within a certain distance, which will become a staple of them going forwards. Of course, as you progress, they do get gradually more complex, culminating in the final International A grade, which is made up entirely of one-lap time trials. However, the learning aspect is just one angle, as these tests also serve an important gameplay purpose. Each of the race events in the game's single-player career have a license attached to them, and can only be entered once you've achieved at least bronze in all of the tests and earned that respective license. This means that you basically have to prove that you're good enough before you can take them on, and also ensures that the tests will be one of the first things you do in the game. When it comes to the tests themselves, let's just say that they didn't hold back. Even getting bronze times can be a real challenge, arguably more so than beating the race events which they unlock. Somewhat ironically, I actually find the final International A license to be the easiest, as it's less about aiming for near perfection, and instead just trying to be consistent over a full lap. Even so, gold times are really only doable for the top percentile of players, but they do at least give you a reason to try and get them. If you can achieve all gold in each test within a license, you earn a bonus prize car. These prize cars cannot be acquired in any other way in GT mode, making them extremely desirable, and they obviously give you a leg up within the career as well. Whilst the experience of doing these tests fundamentally isn't that interesting beyond the challenge, there are some neat details to be found. My personal favourite is that in normal races, you'll see that the grandstands are filled with colour, representing crowds of people. However, in the license tests, they're now empty. It's a small touch, but you've really got to appreciate the attention to detail. Gran Turismo 2 debuted in late 1999, aiming to expand on the original game in pretty much every way, and License Mode was no different. From 3 licenses each with 8 tests, making 24 in total in GT1, there are now 6 with 10 each, making a whopping 60 license tests in GT2. However, a feature introduced in this game is that if you have save data from GT1 with the National A and National B licenses cleared, you can import this into GT2, which is handy. The broad strokes are pretty much the same as in GT1. The tests comprise of completing short sections of track, after which you're then graded based on your time, except for the final tier, now called the Super License, where you have to finish a full lap of the given track. Even still, there are some notable differences within that. For one, there are now actually a handful of career mode races that can be entered without any license, meaning that it isn't strictly necessary to do these tests before starting your career. As for the tests themselves, the increased variety of cars and tracks in the game leads to more variety with these also. For instance, dirt tracks are now featured in a handful of tests as they also appear in the main career. Outside of Japan, the dirt physics were changed so as to give the cars more grip. Whilst the PAL release accounted for this by making the target times tougher, the North American version didn't, resulting in these tests being by far the easiest in the game in that particular region. But speaking of regional differences, it's worth noting that many tests, and not just the ones on dirt, have different target times between PAL and NTSC. For the most part, they're made a bit harder on PAL, but there are 1 or 2 tests where they're actually made slightly easier. Even with the influx of new tracks in GT2, the developers decided to create unique ones just to appear in some of these tests. Most of them represent simple corner complexes, but there are also circle tracks and slaloms too, helping to increase the variety on offer. Probably the most notable one is the section used in IA10, which is actually a reference to the Eau Rouge Radion complex of corners at the real Spa-Francorchamps circuit, a track that wouldn't appear in the series until GT5. When it comes to difficulty, I'd say that getting bronze times in GT2 is noticeably easier than it was in GT1, but the gold times are just as hard, if not harder. IC4, IC9, and the aforementioned IA10 are a few of the most infamous examples. Yet again, if you can manage this, there's a selection of bonus cars on offer, ranging from tuned road cars to Le Mans racers. For just completing the licenses with any grade, you're also rewarded with new circuits in arcade mode, and for beating the Super License, you get the event synthesizer thrown in as well. One quirk of the license tests in GT2, and no other GT game, is in how the target times work. To achieve a certain grade in a test, you have to go under the respective target time. Matching it will result in you getting the lower grade. There are more curiosities to GT2's license tests as well. If you fail a test enough times by coming relatively close to the bronze target, you can earn what's known as the Kids Prize. This effectively counts as passing the test, even though you didn't achieve the required time. A Japanese guidebook for GT2 detailed the requirements on how to get the Kids Prize on each test, including the maximum time permitted, as well as how many times you need to do this to trigger it. Another interesting fact is that in the IC license, there are a couple of tests that use cars with the text D-Rights written on them. It's not widely known about, but D-Rights is the name of the previously mentioned driving school that Kaz himself attended, which is a pretty neat reference, and makes the link between it and these tests even clearer. So, on to Gran Turismo 3. Like most other aspects of this game, what you'll first notice is that the presentation has taken a big step up. For example, the License Center now has its own menu song, which you can hear right now, and there are also unique jingles that play depending on your test results. This includes the first iteration of the now infamous fail music. Structure-wise, there are 6 licenses like in GT2, but only 8 tests per license as in GT1, making 48 tests in total. The biggest difference is that International C has been subbed out in favour of the brand new Rally license, which is necessary to compete in any of the rally events. Once again, prize cards can be attained for all gold, but they are noticeably not as good as they were in the first 2 games. None of them are unique to the licenses, as they can either be bought from the dealership or won from another event in the career. Still, there are some pretty good ones, such as the Viper GTSR concept from the Super License. The unique sections of track from GT2 are not replicated in GT3, with the exception of 2 circle tracks which only appear in their respective tests. There is, however, Complex String, a circuit that can in some ways be thought of as like several license test sections put together as one track. It doesn't appear in any career mode events, but does host 4 different license tests as well as an arcade mode time trial, so I think it's fair to say that this is its primary purpose. The general trend of tests being made slightly harder in the PAL version still remains, but that's not to say that they're easy everywhere else. Bronze times are still tough but achievable for most players, and gold is again only attainable by the top 1%. There are some real ball breakers in there too, such as B8 and especially A7, which requires near millimeter perfect accuracy for the gold time. The tests on dirt tracks are also a bit tougher than they were in GT2 with stricter target times, especially so in North America. Driving on gravel requires a very different approach to tarmac in this game, and so you'll likely need some time to adjust to it. R6, a series of hairpins at Tahiti Maze, is particularly brutal, as it punishes any and all flaws in your technique. As you would expect by now, earning licenses unlocks more events to enter in the main career. However, there is one event which is completely obscured in the menu. That is until you earn the Super License, when it's not only unlocked, but also revealed to be the Formula GT Championship, the longest and toughest event in the game. Whilst GT3 didn't change that much about the license test formula, there is more to say when it comes to Gran Turismo 4. Firstly, after a single game, the rally license is no more, with tests on dirt and all new snow and ice circuits featuring within the other normal licenses like in GT2. But where we had 8 tests per license in GT1, 10 in GT2, and 8 again in GT3, you'll now find 16 in GT4, making 80 tests in total. Maybe it's just me, but I think this might be slightly overkill. Of course, many of the tests in these games share similarities to those from the previous titles, but I think GT4 is the first in the series where the tests actively call back to ones from the past games. In the B license, the first 4 tests directly mimic those from the original Gran Turismo, down to the exact car being used. But that's not to say that GT4 doesn't have its own ideas. The massive increase in new cars and tracks results in much more variety with these tests, and there are new types of tests as well. In between GT3 and GT4, there was a spin-off title called Gran Turismo Concept, and it included the Course License mode, where you're tasked with completing a lap of each circuit within a time limit. But one addition was that you could choose to have an AI-controlled pace car running in front of you. Well, in GT4, they took this optional feature and turned it into its own type of test, the one-lap guide run. Now, in some ways this is useful, as it can be a great tool to help you learn new circuits. But at the same time, it can also make things more difficult, as hitting or overtaking the pace car is now a new way to fail. If you're an experienced player, these tests can not only be pretty tedious thanks to their length, but also quite frustrating, as the pace car can sometimes catch you out by braking a lot earlier than you might expect. But this wasn't the only idea from a previous game that GT4 expanded on. GT4 Prologue introduced coffee break events, short challenges that centered around knocking over or avoiding knocking over cones. In GT4 they return, with one in each license. The game describes them as fun and relaxing stages, but in some cases they can be even more stressful than the tests themselves. The good news is that there is no time limit to achieve bronze on any of them, and either way, they're entirely optional activities. Some tests in this game force you to have stability control turned on, which I personally really hate, and actually makes some of them harder. On the whole though, I'd have to say that GT4's license tests are a bit easier than the previous games. The main hurdle I find is dealing with the game's somewhat twitchy and over-responsive handling, but once you get used to it, the actual target times aren't too bad. Once again, you can transfer save data from previous games, in this case GT3 and GT4 Prologue, to have the national A and B licenses cleared for you. But GT4 is also the only Gran Turismo game that's known to have cheat codes that you can use to clear license tests, which were only discovered in 2023. After 365 in-game days have passed, you can input the codes on screen to auto-complete any license test. With the previous games, I touched on some regional differences when it comes to the target times you're given, but GT4 does something else as well. For 2 of the Super License tests, S11 and S16, the test car was changed between the original Japanese release and international versions. In S11, it went from a Pescarolo C60 to a Renault Clio V6. And for S16, the Sauber Mercedes C9 was swapped to the 190e touring car. Given the nature of the 2 circuits where they take place, Opera Paris and Nürburgring Nordschleife, I'm pretty certain that this was done to make them easier. Driving these tracks on the limit with high downforce prototypes is no easy feat, but I'd argue that it's called the Super License for a reason. The other major change that I've yet to mention is that you can now earn 3 prize cars per license, one each for all gold, silver, and bronze. This means that what was previously a luxury only enjoyed by the best of the best can now be experienced by almost anyone. Naturally, better prize cars are reserved for higher grades, but there are still some decent bronze prizes, notably the Nismo 270R from the IA license. Many of the cars given out are either tuned models, concept vehicles, or classics, many of which can only be acquired here. In the previous games, all that mattered was either getting at least all bronze to pass the license, or getting all golds for the prize car, meaning that the silver grade was effectively pointless. This small change also helps to rectify this minor design flaw, which is nice to see. Presentation-wise, I really like what they did here. The theming is just so on point. I imagine that for a lot of people, when they picture the Gran Turismo license center, this is what they see, complete with bouncing cones. However, if there is one thing that most players are almost guaranteed to remember from GT4's license tests, it has to be the fail music. Gran Turismo 5 is the first game in the series to really shake up how the license tests are handled. With the previous games, each of the licenses could be attempted at any time provided you had completed the ones that come before. This meant that if you wanted to, you could just blaze through them in one go before doing anything else in the game. With GT5, this is no longer the case. Every license has a required A-spec level before you can even attempt it. But how do you increase your level? Well, it's simple. Complete races, special events, and license tests. In GT5, earning licenses doesn't directly unlock career mode events like in the past games. Instead, the events unlock based on your driver level, which can be increased by doing license tests, among various other things. This means that the license center is now an entirely optional side activity. And the major changes don't end there. Whilst the format of these tests is mainly what we're used to, completing short timed sections of track, the final 2 tests of each license involve racing scenarios where you have to beat other cars. And in the Super license, every single test takes this form, feeling more like GT4 driving missions than license tests. In total, there are 6 licenses, including International C returning from GT2, making 60 tests in total, 40 of which being traditional time challenges, and 20 as racing scenarios. The one-lap guide runs do not return from GT4, thankfully, but having a different prize car for each grade is carried over. All of the prize cars can also be bought from the dealership, but given the rarity of certain used cars, they may as well be exclusive to the licenses. GT5 was the first mainline GT game to receive updates, which included changes to the handling model. Bear in mind that for all of the games from this point onwards, I'm going to be talking about them in the state that they're currently in respect to the difficulty of the tests. With GT5, I find that the timed tests are similar to GT4, if not a little bit easier. I think by this point, bronze is doable for just about anyone, and whilst gold times will still take some effort, they're not as exclusive as they once were. The only exception to this from my experience is actually one of the stopping tests, IB1. I find it insanely difficult to get gold on, and from my research, this seems to be the result of physics changes at some point, as it wasn't always this challenging. The racing scenario tests, on the other hand, are quite the opposite, and I think they're by far the easiest to gold. You don't even have to worry about failing by hitting other cars. Another thing to note is that all of the tests have you driving premium cars, almost all of which being road-going models. I'm not entirely sure why they didn't use more race cars in the higher licenses, but that's just another way in which they differ from the past games. What is there to say about the license tests in Gran Turismo 6? No, seriously, that was a genuine question. What am I supposed to say? So unlike GT5, the tests are once again mandatory, but you still don't get to decide the pace at which you do them. GT6's career works on a star system where you're locked to a certain tier of events until you can earn the necessary amount of stars to move on. Stars are earned by completing races, and once you've earned enough, you can then take on the respective license to gain access to the tier above. For the IA and Super license, there is also a championship you have to beat before you can do this. As for the tests themselves, there are 5 per license, with 5 licenses, making 25 tests overall, the lowest amount since the first game. The tests mostly revolve around cars and tracks that are new to the game by way of the traditional timed events. In terms of the level of challenge, there is a noticeable drop-off in this game compared to the others. For most of the tests, I think that gold is realistically achievable by almost anyone. On some, I was able to manage it by multiple seconds on my very first attempt. And bronze is so easy that just thinking about doing it means you pretty much already have. The only exception to this is with the super license, where a couple of the one-lap time trials can be a little tricky, in particular S5. However, in this case, the difficulty doesn't come from the target times, which I think are more than reasonable, but instead, mostly because Ascari Race Resort is an extremely technical track, and the Veyron handles like total ass. As for the prize cars, GT6 makes the strange decision to give out prizes only for at least all bronze and all gold, meaning that silver is once again a completely pointless grade. I suppose it's worth mentioning that coffee break challenges return in GT6, but not as part of the licenses, so that's my excuse to not talk about them. 2017's Gran Turismo Sport is well known for ripping up the classic GT formula and doing its own thing, but not everything was scrapped. Whilst there is no traditional career mode presence, the game still includes the driving school. In essence, this mode functions the same as the license center from previous entries, with the exception that it doesn't actually give you any licenses, considering that when the game launched, there weren't any race events to be licensed for. This explains the change of name and means that it's once again just an optional side activity. In this mode, we have 48 tests in total, separated into 6 stages of 8, 3 being labelled as beginner and 3 intermediate. For the most part, the tests are the usual stuff we expect, starting off with basic challenges where all you have to do is drive in a straight line, and progressing up to full lap time trials. I will say that the progression of these tests feels a bit more drawn out than normal. For example, it takes 8 entire tests before you're even allowed to turn a corner. Overall, I think the tests themselves are a little bit tougher than those in GT6, but still not a patch on the earlier games. Bronze is achievable by almost anyone, with gold also being a realistic target for most. Also, here's a fun Easter egg. The fail music in this game is the same as the one from the tuning shop in GT5. With there not being a proper single-player career, this means that the driver training aspect has now become the sole priority. This manifests in the form of not just teaching players the basics of driving, but also racing. In the latter stages, there are a handful of tests that focus on racing scenarios, like in GT5. However, these ones are a bit more complex, as you have to do things like use fresh tyres to gain places after a pit stop, or save enough fuel to reach the finish. There's also one test that has you drifting, which is pretty left field. Because GT Sport was so light on content when it originally released, there isn't a huge amount of car and track variety in the tests themselves. All I'll say is that you better like Group 4 race cars, because you're going to be seeing a lot of them. One aspect that didn't change with the driving school is receiving prize cards. You earn a prize car regardless of the grade you received. These prizes are chosen at random, but within a set performance class, ranging from N200 road cars in the first stage, up to Group 1 prototypes for the final. If you complete all of the tests, you can also earn a couple of extra prize cars. For all silver, there's the Lamborghini Veneno, and all gold bags you the Nissan GT-R safety car. The latter in particular is a pretty cool prize, as not only is it a reference to the infamous R34 GT-R pace car, it's also entirely exclusive to the driving school. You can't acquire it through any other means, which makes it a totally unique vehicle in GT Sport. The fact that there were only beginner and intermediate levels at launch implied that more tests might have been planned at some point as DLC, but for whatever reason, this never happened. Gran Turismo 7 was touted as a true return to form for the series, and with license tests being such a core feature of the past games, expectations were high. To start, we have 5 licenses including 10 tests each, so 50 tests in total, a pretty average amount. The overall structure of these tests is about what you'd expect, mimicking the older games almost to a T. Many of the tests themselves also appear to be callbacks to the past games, such as IB10. Like with other parts of GT7's career, the license center features appearances from GT World Series esports drivers. Each license is hosted by a different one, with them providing encouragement and tips for each test. And you might just find these helpful, as even though they still aren't quite as tough as the first few games, these tests can once again put up a decent challenge. I'd say that most experienced players shouldn't find them too hard to get gold on, but it's no longer just a given. Beating these tests once again feels like it means something. This all culminates in the final Super License test, where you have to pilot a Porsche 917K at Spa-Francorchamps. But that's not all, because you're also on a drying track, meaning that if you go beyond the racing line, you're gonna be in trouble. If you can complete a clean lap, I don't think the target times are that tough. But when completing a clean lap itself is not so straightforward, this makes S10 easily the toughest test in the game. Well, excluding the brief period of time around the game's launch, when there was a glitch where tests that took place on gravel circuits wouldn't equip dirt tyres to the car. This was soon fixed, but as some people showed, a few of the tests were actually still doable. But only just. As for the prizes, GT7 continues the weird trend from GT6 of rewarding you for bronze and gold, but not silver. The prize cars themselves are decent, but not unique or especially rare, as almost all of them can be bought from the new cars dealership. Now, with GT7 trying to evoke the spirit of the older games, naturally you would expect the licenses to give you access to more race events as you progress. And this is the case, until the game just kinda gives up on that. The final championship in the quote-unquote main career only requires a National A license, meaning that the 3 beyond that unlock absolutely nothing. It's an odd decision to say the least, but that doesn't make the other licenses completely pointless. You can still earn the prize cars of course, and for the first time ever in a game with a GT mode, beating tests also awards credits. One of the game's trophies implies the existence of a rain license. Personally, what I imagined was a series of tests that focused on wet weather driving specifically, in a similar vein to the rally license in GT3. However, there is no such rain license in GT7. To get this trophy, all you have to do is beat 3 tests specifically: A5, IB6, and IA7. But if you were looking for more license tests in this game, then I've got some good news for you. In November 2023, the Spec 2 update for GT7 was released, and among its various additions and improvements, we can find the Master licenses. This is an all-new set of 50 license tests that unlock after you complete the ones in the base game. But with their level of difficulty being so prominent, how do they actually stack up? Well, I think they're definitely a bigger challenge. Right from the first test of the Master B license, a usual stopping test but now in the wet, I noticed the difference. The margin for error is noticeably slimmer, and they use trickier car and track combos as well. That said, there is still some leeway, so you don't have to be inch perfect. But this is still the closest the series has come to the first few games in terms of difficulty. The decision to double the number of license tests with this update seems to be twofold. Firstly, to give players more content and things to do, and secondly, to make better use of the new cars and tracks that have been added to the game since it launched. In fact, the Spec 2 update itself introduced the Lake Louise circuits, bringing snow driving back to the series. In total, 5 Master license tests take place here. That's 10% of them. And out of all of them, I'd have to say that they're some of the toughest. It takes some time to really understand the driving physics on snow and how to get the most out of them. Because of this, I found that Master S5 took by far the longest to get gold on, and I've heard likewise from many other people as well. Given that most of the licenses in the base game don't serve any functional purpose, it's no surprise that these ones don't either. Again, the only incentive to beat them is for the rewards. For all bronze, you get roulette tickets, and all gold gives you the car that you would have driven in the final test of that respective license. This means that you can earn some super rare and high value machines, like the Porsche 962C and McLaren MP44. But wait, I have another addendum to this section. My first Gran Turismo debuted in December 2024 as a free demo of GT7, and it too contains its own set of licenses. Each of them take place over the 3 playable tracks in the game: Trial Mountain, Deep Forest, and Kyoto Driving Park Miyabi, and completing them gives you access to music rally and race events. Given the purpose of the demo, you won't be shocked to learn that these tests are very easy to pass, but it seems like getting gold is still somewhat of a challenge. So, what exactly have we learned? As I stated at the beginning, license tests are both loved and hated within the Gran Turismo community. Some people object to them on a fundamental level, and in many ways I can understand. After all, there aren't many racing games that sit you down and make you learn the basics of driving every time you start them. I don't think there are many people who'd argue that including them in, say, Forza Motorsports would make those games any better. However, I do subscribe to the idea that they become such a core part of the series that abandoning them outright just isn't really an option anymore. So in that case, how do you leverage the strengths of a game mode like this? Well, through my analysis of license tests in this series, I have identified 3 main pillars that I think contribute to whether or not we find them worthwhile. The first is challenge. For most people who enjoy them, the challenge of these tests is a key factor in what makes them appealing and memorable. Whether you're aiming for bronze, silver, or gold times, you should have to push yourself to achieve your targets. In fact, I think the decision to have these 3 different target times for each test is inspired, because no matter your skill level, you will ideally always have something to aim for. This is why I think the tests being so easy in GT6, for example, makes them feel pointless. If there's no challenge in getting the top rank, then they just feel like a waste of time for more experienced players, something to just mindlessly grind through so that you can get to the racing. Of course, it's very important that they aren't made too difficult either. They should still be passable by the vast majority of players, even if some have to give 100%. Gold times on the other hand should be exclusive to only those near the top, but still with some degree of movement. I'm not saying that you should have to be esports caliber to achieve them, but you've got to at least be pretty decent. It's also important that difficulty scales upwards as you progress, not just by the margins for success getting slimmer, but also with the cars getting faster and the tracks more technical. This is another way to test players and also keep things from getting stale. The second pillar is showcase. What I mean by this is that these tests should showcase a wide variety of the game's content. In a way, the test should act as a taster of what's to come by showcasing the many interesting cars and tracks that you can experience, thus getting you excited for the rest of the game. Of course, it's also important not to go overboard with this. GT4 had a ton of new cars and tracks, but I still don't think that justified it having 16 tests per license, making 80 in total. Personally, I think the sweet spot is around 50 tests, like in GT7 originally, but your opinion may differ. Like many things, it's not just about quantity, but also quality. For example, using certain cars and tracks in key tests makes them all the more memorable. Think about the Toyota GT1, one of the absolute best cars in GT2 and GT3. As such, the fact that it appears in the final Super License test in both games makes perfect sense, and is arguably a big part of why it has such a strong legacy in this series. Or what about the Porsche 917K in GT7, an already iconic Le Mans legend that was seen quite prominently in the marketing of the game? Using it in the final test, and at the legendary Spa circuit no less, is so fitting. And then to have it take place on a drying track that's still wet in places, thus showcasing the potential of one of the most anticipated features in the game, is just chef's kiss perfection. Listen, I don't think Polyphony got much right with GT7 single player, but when it comes to the license tests, and S10 in particular, they absolutely nailed it. It might just be my favourite test in the entire series. If only the rest of the game could be this memorable, challenging, and creative. As for the third and final pillar, I describe it as purpose. Basically, the act of completing tests and thus earning licenses has to be meaningful within the wider context of the game. The easiest way to achieve this is through each license granting you access to something new, whether that be new race events or unique cars. This is the most critical factor in why the licenses in the first few games feel so much more important than they do in more recent ones, because they contribute directly towards your progression. Having access to more race events gives you far more options in how you play through the game, so the decision of when in your playthrough to take on each license actually has a tangible impact. I also think that this is why GT6's licenses feel so arbitrary, even though they do technically unlock more events. You don't get to choose when to do them, it's all predetermined by the game based on the star system. This means that you could remove them from the game and the experience would be pretty much the same. As for the prize cars, having more toys to play with is obviously going to impact how you play through the game from that point onwards. As long as they're reasonably well balanced and not totally and utterly broken, then I don't see any issues here. Whilst you can technically earn some insane prize cars from these licenses very early in some of the older games, not only will hardly anyone actually attempt this, most simply won't be able to. Remember, prize cars were only given out for getting all golds in the first 3 games, which isn't exactly a walk in the park. However, saying all this, I feel like there is one pretty major flaw with the entire concept of license tests. So, we all know that the whole idea behind the license tests was to recreate the experience of attending a real-life driving school, and learning techniques which you can then take with you into a race. But the problem is that the experience they're trying to achieve will never fully translate into the game. The reason why is that driving a car in a game, no matter how realistic that game is, simply isn't the same as driving one in reality. In real life, there are consequences. You can hurt yourself as well as other people, and that's not even mentioning the financial angle. This means that starting slow and gradually building up is the best thing to do. However, in a video game, there is absolutely no harm in taking the training wheels off if you're confident enough. Maybe back in 1997, when simulation-style racing games were not so common, this slow and gradual approach made more sense. But now more than ever, it just feels so unnecessary. The stopping tests are easily the most laughable cases, as I don't understand how they can teach anything that the person playing doesn't already know. As long as you have a basic understanding of A, how to use a controller, and B, what the brakes do, then these tests are completely irrelevant. Even Gran Turismo itself has admitted that they are pretty much just trial and error. Whilst tests like these are just a small part of the wider experience, I think they encapsulate the license tests at their absolute worst. Not just tedious, but also frustrating, as it can feel like getting gold on some of them is more down to luck than skill. And in the older games, they can also highlight shortcomings in the physics engine, unless throwing your car into a slide really is the ideal way to slow down. Now, to some degree, the developers were aware of how pointless these early game tests are, as in GT2 and GT4, you can skip the first two licenses if you have save data from the previous game with them already completed. But if it were up to me, I would make these early licenses entirely optional for everyone. So I guess it's kind of ironic that GT7 does the exact opposite. Ultimately, there are now far better methods to improve as a driver than just being given a section of track and a time limit and being told to get on with it. When you look at it this way, license tests as a method of driver training seems so outdated, and that's likely why most other racing games trust their players to learn through normal gameplay instead. I don't hate license tests. In fact, as I hope this video demonstrates, when done well, I really enjoy them. I just think that in some respects, they can take away from these games more than what they add. But it doesn't have to be this way. By leveraging what those who like them actually enjoy about them, and making them an integral part of the gameplay loop that provides something interesting, they can be a fun challenge, much like other side modes that we've seen in these games. At the end of the day, having a unique feature with such a strong legacy in the series is something that Gran Turismo should really value. Because even if they're not for everyone, license tests are an important part of what makes Gran Turismo, Gran Turismo.